In the Torah portion of Bamidbar, we begin with a census, a counting of the Jewish people. What is the point of that? So in the Zohar, the classic work of the Kabbalah, which always describes the events in the Torah so poetically and so beautifully, it says the following. I'll read it out very briefly. When the tabernacle was erected, all the worlds came to perfection. All the higher and lower worlds were centered. Now the tabernacle was complete. God wanted to count the troops of the Torah. For every item that needs to be settled in its place does not settle until it is uttered by the mouth and is counted. The lesson here is a very powerful one. When I was in school, they always used to say, bricks and stones can break my bones, but words can't do anything. We grew up in this idea that the use of words is, in a sense, harmless, but it's so not true. Psychologists have discovered how deeply wounding abusive language is, and here the Torah is stating in the opposite sense, that when something is beloved to God, He wants it counted, He wants it said verbally. And similarly, many of the mitzvahs of the Torah depend on speech. And the lesson is quite simple: to be so careful, to speak nicely, to compliment people, to make people feel good with our mouths, because that really is one of the most powerful weapons, the most powerful tools we've been given in life, the mouth. Now, we read here that the Torah is given Bamidbar Sinai, in the Sinai desert. That's the first verse of this Torah portion. And the Medrash says very beautifully, in Numbers Rabbah, that the Torah actually was given in three settings: fire, water, and the desert. Fire, as we read in Exodus 19:18, that the whole mountain of Sinai smoked because God had descended upon it in fire. Water, as we read in Judges chapter 5, verses 4 to 5. The earth trembled and the heavens dropped. The clouds also dropped water before God, the God of Israel. And the desert, from the opening of this week's Torah portion, that the Torah is given in the Sinai desert. Now, what is the point of that? So the Medrash says, just as these three are freely available for all the inhabitants of the earth, so too the Torah is freely available to anyone. It's not copyright. Anyone can study it. Anyone can learn it. It was given in a barren place, and a place of fire and water, to show its universality, to show its universal accessibility to all of mankind. Now, Rabbi Shmuel Borenstein of Sokachov, who was a 20th century Hasidic rabbi, said that these three settings of fire, water, and desert also hint to the attitudes, the correct attitudes to which we should be studying the Torah. Fire is, of course, passion. We should take a Torah text and get excited about it, see the incredible intellectual juice which is dripping from every verse. Then there is water. Water is cool. I mean, obviously water can be hot, but in its natural setting, water tends to cool us, which is the idea of intellectual detachment. We shouldn't read things blindly and just say, oh, okay. We should read the Torah with a critical eye, with immersing our brain into it, so that we study it properly. You can't understand something unless you come from a point of emotional, intellectual detachment. And finally, the desert. Why is it given in the desert? Because you have to run away a little bit from the pleasures of the world and a little bit from what you want to do in life in order to embrace the Torah. It's not an easy, it's not just a book you read in bed and then chuck on the floor and go to sleep. It's a lifestyle, it's a way of life. You cannot really appreciate the Torah properly unless you incorporate it to some extent into your life. And that is why it's the desert, because only when you desert some of your baser animal desires can you fully embrace the Torah. Rabbi Meir Shapiro of Lublin interpreted this Medrash differently. He said that this shows these three settings of fire, water, and the desert allude to the range of different times and conditions, whether as individuals or collectively, that we are to uphold the Torah. In fire is like Abraham, who leapt into this fiery furnace. So that represents the devotion of the individual. Water reminds us of how Nachshon ben Aminadav walked into the Sea of Reeds, when it split for the Jewish people, when they were being chased by the Egyptians, and that represents collective commitment. The Jews went together into the river, and they knew that it could have drowned them, but they did it collectively. And then finally, the desert. The Jews stayed in the desert for 40 years because they were looking to follow the way of God. They could have just said, oh, Torah, religion, Judaism, this is too much, let's go back to Egypt, or let's just go and find somewhere else to live. No, they stayed with God for 40 years. And that's the idea of sustained commitment. So there's individual devotion, collective devotion, and sustained commitment. The three recipes for a meaningful spiritual existence. Chapter 1, verse 50, we read the commandment of guarding the temple, which is done by the Levites. Why did the Levites guard the temple? Because the Kabbalah explains that the Levites are rooted in gevurah, in severity. Now, of course, we all have a bit of severity in us, but I guess Levites are predisposed to an additional measure of it. And why was this guarding necessary from a spiritual perspective? Because whenever there's goodness, whenever there's holiness, there's always parasites, spiritual parasites, that come and sap energy. See, because in the Jewish idea, we don't believe in a duality of good and evil. We don't believe there's a Satan out there who is independent of God, who is vying with the powers of goodness on the battleground of this earth. We believe that there's Satan, there is a Jewish idea of Satan, but we believe that him and all the demons and all the negative forces, the klipot, they are all really, they're servants of God, and they actually nurture their energy from God. They don't have an independent energy source. Everything has to come from God. So when you have like a temple standing there, a tabernacle which is holy and it's emanating holiness, all these klipot and demons and all this spiritual garbage, they come and sap energy. They want to get energy because they don't have their own energy. And that is why we have to guard the temple, to prevent these negative forces sapping the energy. And that is why you need gevurah. All guarding restraint comes from severity, erecting walls, erecting boundaries, having principles. And this is the same in our own life. If you have something precious, people will come after it. People will copy it. They'll sell it for cheaper. They'll imitate you. Your enemies will try and pull you down. You always need a little bit of gevurah. As much as we need to be integrative and feel one with humanity, we need to have a win-win attitude in life and not go and be in the pursuit of dominating our fellow creatures. But there needs to be, says the Torah, everything has balance. There needs to be gevurah. There needs to be a protection of anything that is holy and good. Finally, a little bit of Kabbalah. Chapter 3, verse 2, the verse states, the firstborn, Nadav and Avihu, Elazar and Isama, implying that Nadav and Avihu were both the firstborn. Obviously, you can't have two firstborn, but there's a Kabbalistic idea behind this. And that is that Nadav and Avihu were both actually two halves of the same soul. They really didn't have a whole soul themselves. A soul split into two, and they got half each. And that's why they really were the firstborn. Because they were a Gilgul, a reincarnation of Cain, of Cain. Remember him? The older brother of Abel, who mercilessly killed his brother at the beginning of the creation story in Genesis. Well, he was reincarnated into Nadav and Avihu. And that is why he's called the firstborn, because he was Adam's firstborn. And says the Arizal, Rabbi Isaac Luria, 16th century mystic, that later he was reincarnated into Yishai, into Jesse, who was the father of King David, where he achieved his final tikkun, his spiritual healing for his earlier mistakes. Spiritual lesson for the week. The Torah was given in a barren desert, teaching you to be open-minded and not influenced by your surroundings when studying it. We're all influenced by our surroundings. We can't help it. But the Torah really is a wisdom which has been around for thousands of years, which has survived through every culture, which has informed every culture, which has nurtured the Jews in every culture, and therefore even though we embrace it in our own cultural context and through our own gladed lenses of understanding, remember that there is a core of it, a core of spiritual truth in the Torah, in every verse, in every word, which transcends the trappings of your own surrounding. And if you can penetrate through to that wisdom, you can escape the limitations and the drudgery of your life by finding something that truly transcends it. Thank you for listening, and join us again, please, next week for Torah in 10.